You can send your questions or your comments via the chat in the middle bottom of your screen. For those of you who are on Facebook, and we want to welcome you as well, please send your comments or your questions in the Facebook chat. We have team members who are monitoring both platforms and are also monitoring on Twitter. So the session is going to be recorded and it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. So feel free to subscribe, like, and share. Our initial presentation is going to take just about 35 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have 20 minutes for questions and responses by the panelists. So, of course, we're just going to ask you to be very respectful in your questions and in your comments. This is a sharing exercise, and if we don't have the answers, it's okay. When we do have them, if there are points that we need to come back to you, we will definitely reach back out to you and share those responses. Now, this is the kind of session that we want to have more often in future. So just let us know in the comments what other topics you would like for us to discuss so that we can put that on our roster, and then we can have a really a scheduled activity that is the EHE Talk in panel discussion format. All right, so getting right into it. In March of this year, the government of Antigua and Barbuda ratified or agreed to abide by the Escazú Agreement, which is really an international agreement within Latin America and the Caribbean. The agreement has three main pillars, and these pillars are access to information, participation in decision-making, and access to justice. So underpinning the agreement is the notion that environmental defenders or persons who speak out on behalf of the environment, they must be protected at all costs. So today's discussion is going to highlight the present experience of environmental defenders in Antigua and Barbuda and discuss the process for the implementation of our environmental rights. So that's our great overview. And so we are so excited today to have our three panelists. First of all, I want to introduce you to Ruth Spencer. And Ruth, just tell us a little bit about yourself. Your mic's on mute.
Good evening, everyone. I'm glad that you can join. My background is a development economist, development in the sense that I'm concerned about people development. There are different types of pathways you can go in economics, but development is my focus. So my very first job up to what I'm doing now has always been people-centered development. And I like to hear their solutions, and I try to find ways. I like to hear their ideas, and I find ways to make solutions possible.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ruth. Elisha?
Hi, my name is Elisha George. I'm a media personality, journalist, producer. I've been doing this for about 7 years. I started in TV broadcasting, radio news. I've done script writing as well, production of TV series, short documentaries like the one that is currently out now.
Thank you, Elisha. And finally, Rashane.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thanks for having me on. I'm Rashane Cunningham, attorney at law and managing partner of Cunningham Law Caribbean. I predominantly practice in Antigua, and I maintain a regional practice across the Caribbean in Jamaica, Montserrat, and St. Kitts and Nevis. I am able to speak on the laws of treaties and how the Escazú Agreement really affects us on a domestic level and how domestic law actually relates with international law.
Excellent. So we have a really fantastic panel this evening, and we're really excited to just jump right into our discussion. So I'm going to start with Elisha this evening. So Elisha, you recently kind of shook things up in Antigua and Barbuda with the release of your documentary on the Yida Special Economic Zone. Can you tell us a little bit about what you hoped to achieve with this documentary?
Okay, no problem. I'm sure when a lot of people saw this documentary, it was a big eye-opener for them. They were a bit surprised. And that is exactly the reaction that I wanted. Because we've heard about this project, some of us, and we've heard about it to the extent of mangrove removals, or we see this big wall that says the Barbuda Special Economic Zone, but we don't know what it's for. And so that is what my intention was, to make people aware as to how this project is going to affect them, how it's going to affect the environment. And for those of us who depend on the environment, well, predominantly like the fishers and the farmers, I wanted it to hit a chord so that people can stop and think for a moment and said, wait, what's going on? I didn't know this was happening. And that is exactly what happened.
Great, thank you so much. Can you tell us a bit about your experience when you were trying to access information to compile the documentary? What was that like?
Tedious. It was tedious and it was a little bit overwhelming because in order for me to break down the documentary into the 7-minute video, it took a lot of exclusion. There was so much information when I did the research. At some point, I felt like I wanted to just scream and say, you know what, I'm not doing this anymore. Because from all over, you had different viewpoints. Then I had to go through the laws and the licenses and over and over and over just to pretty much understand, wait, okay, this is happening, this isn't happening. What's the interpretation of this? So I had to become, in essence, somewhat of a lawyer, if Rushane doesn't mind me saying that, but I had to be in order to understand the legal framework of the economic zone firstly, and then to allow people to understand it through my perspective, at least, and to the perspective of the persons like yourself who were featured in the documentary.
Mm-hmm. Did you find it difficult to get access to just the environmental information, though? Was it an easy process to do that?
Most of my research was online. And so I would say it was a bit difficult because some of the specific documents that I was looking for, I couldn't find it. There were references, there were links, but the links would turn up dead, if I'm using the correct phrase. You know, when you click on the link, there was nothing. And so I had to depend a lot on persons like Martin Dudley, for example, who would have been following this from its inception, by the way, and who has a wealth of knowledge on that. So I had to lean a bit on his knowledge and try to put that together. So yes, it was difficult. Trying to get information or answers from the authorities themselves proved a dead end because it felt like everything was meant to be a secret or undercover. And when you mentioned Yida, everybody, you know, their chest starts closing in, or their hat starts to raise, and they're like, okay, what's she gonna ask? What does she want to know about Yida this time? So yes, I would say it was a bit difficult.
Okay, thank you for sharing that experience. There's one question that I have, and it's, I think, a question that many Antiguans and Barbudans will wonder about. Are you concerned about political backlash? And if you are, why? And if you're not, why not?
Okay. So I'm originally from Dominica. I moved here officially about 5.5, I think about 6 years actually ago. And one of the running jokes that I had when I was doing this documentary is that if you don't see me after this time, just know that I got deported. Because it was such a sensitive topic and it was a topic that everybody was trying to avoid. But at the end of the day, I said, you know, if I don't do this, who will? Because that's the point of being a journalist. That's the point of being a media person, to allow people to understand how the decisions lawmakers make, in essence, affect them. It's like when you watch Parliament as a regular citizen and they're passing laws, you're listening and you're confused, you don't know what's going on. I wanted to break that down into layman terms and help people understand. So for me, I wasn't fearful or concerned because I'm not a political person. I don't really dabble in politics. My thing is I report the facts. And if you want to dispute the facts, then we can talk about that.
Yes. One of the things that you said that I really love that you said is that if you don't do it, who will? And I think that is how a lot of environmental defenders feel, that if I am not the one to conserve these species or conserve these traditional spaces and these cultural areas, if I'm not the one who will do it, then who will? And so that's a huge part of our drive, because we know that we have to be the ones, because we love our country, we love our space, we love where we are. So thank you so much, Elisha. I'm now going to move on to Ruth. And Ruth has been a negotiator on the Escazú agreement for some time. And so Ruth, I want to know that we've mentioned that the Escazú agreement is based on 3 main pillars. How are these pillars determined? And can you tell us about the process to get to where we have now ratified or agreed to abide by this agreement? So unmute your mic, and if you can speak to us.
Well, I was an NGO representative. I would be considered a member of the public, but the first meeting that I attended, I grasped the information very easily. And when they invited me and asked me for updates, all the meetings, I was always able to say something. And I think they saw that trait in me versus some countries would have nothing to report. And it seemed every meeting, they normally would fund the government delegate, who was Senator Hyman Payne, but they always found funds to allow me to go to the meeting. So I would actually sit at the head table with Senator Payne, and we worked very good together. She explained a lot of things to me. She's the lawyer, she has the legal mind, but she always empowered me. The negotiation process was always about words. The governments couldn't agree on a word, and it would have, the meeting would come to an end and it would go till the next time they have a meeting. But this meeting was different in that it's not like the other agreements where governments negotiate among themselves. They had this public participation mechanism. And there's a link, if anybody wants to be a part of that mechanism, they can register. With that mechanism, you can join the meetings, you can ask questions, you can make contributions. And because of this public participation mechanism, the agreement has been very rich because you're getting inputs from academia, public citizens who are interested. So it provided a very wide scope. And so the public could intervene in the discussions, but really it would be the government delegates to decide if the inputs of the public would have been accepted. And there were lawyers from all over the world. Europe has a similar process, the Ahawas Convention, and it's similar to the Escazú, and these people were always at the meetings. You have human rights lawyers. So you had some of the best minds. Even the CCJ had Winston Anderson at the meetings. People from the OECS Secretariat would be at the meetings. So it really had a strong Caribbean flavor.
Right.
I asked how these pillars were determined. Well, these pillars came out of the real convention because these are the critical points for input by the public. The public, how, you have to have information and you have to have a mechanism to participate. So these are how the terms came up, the access to justice mechanism, It was always there, but countries now are at different starting places. But these are like the bottom. These are the ground floor. You can build on that, you can add to it. So this process, you were able to interact so very good with the government, environmental ministers, senior technicians. So today, I have a lot of them on email. If I go to a meeting in Costa Rica, I know the minister, I can tell her I'm coming, and we network, you meet them at other meetings. So you build a strong relationship. And that was part of the process, capacity building, forms of cooperation that we can lean on to empower our situations. Thank
Okay,
you.
great. So the format for the Escazú agreement, essentially it was there before. So what they've done now is just fine-tuned it so it's in one specific place, and then because it's in that one place, it gives it a bit more strength.
Yes, and UN ECLAC is the secretariat, and they are very outreaching. I have a very good relationship with them, and I find they kind of use me like as a think tank. And I think they realize you really need the strong public involvement.
Yes.
So they're relating to the government, and they're still relating to me, And
because
as I said, go ahead.
Because what I'm gathering then, Ruth, is that what they need is for the people to tell them how they want to be interacted with. How do you, as a person who will be able to access information, who will be able to access justice, who's a part of decision making, they actually want to see what you think about it so that it makes sense for you and not just for them.
Yes.
So here's a thing that I want to ask you. What do you expect will be the change on the ground once the agreement comes into force?
Okay, right now, I think the first thing that we're going to have to do, we have to look at what domestic laws we have in place, would be the Environmental Protection and Management Bill as a start. We have to see how the articles of Escazú fit in with the domestic legislation. See where there are the gaps, and we start from that. And it requires capacity building of everybody in the government service, the lawyers, the magistrates, the judges, because in countries like Chile, Argentina, they've already started that process, educating. And I spoke with a magistrate today, and she was so happy. She told me, I'd be glad to build my competencies in the environmental issues. So, that made me feel so very happy.
Excellent. So you just mentioned Latin America, and I'm really glad that you mentioned them. I know that in those countries, we've seen that environmental defenders are, they're killed mercilessly. Yes. It's quite a serious thing to be an environmental defender in Latin America. So I know that's why it's important for them to have kind of been pushing for the ratification. Have you seen that there's been a strong support from Caribbean nations and environmental defenders in the Caribbean to see this agreement happen as well?
Well, I know for St. Lucia, I see the communications, I see the PS involved, I see the legal department involved, I see real strong public education on the ground, and they just recently ratified it. So they so want to help me to build my capacity that they invite me to join the Zoom meetings. They keep me in various forms of correspondence. So I feel very good. So St. Lucia and Antigua look as if they're going to be the leaders in the Escazú agreement. And as I always said, I'm glad the government took the bold step, and we have to work in partnership to build the competencies, because the lawyers in the service may not know about it. For some people, it's the first time they're hearing about it. Maybe when we went on the radio today, a lot of people have not known about it. But I think people realize how decision-making is taking place in Antigua. It should not be like that, because this environment is for all of us to enjoy. So how it's going to happen, we have to have a say in it. And let me tell you, as I said, Antigua has comprehensive legislation. All the things of Escazú are in Environment Protection Bill. And you know why I am so involved? I don't know if you remember in 2015 when the NGOs went to Parliament, we were involved in a consultation. The laws were on the books for 10 years. Nothing was taking place, and we pushed and we pushed. And I remember Bernard Warner and his members coming into Parliament with crutches and wheelchairs. We were pushing because we know this Environmental Protection and Management Bill had a lot of things that would empower the groups. So to have these laws passed and not enforced, as I said, these things are on the book. Access to justice is on the environment. So it means now we have to put the meat on the bones. It's in the law, and we have to add the components for the protection, the guarantees of the environmental defenders, and the measures to ensure that vulnerable and marginalized groups have the same decision making. So we at the bottom now, we have to build and add on to it.
Great. Thank you so much, Ruth. And you can see why Ruth ends up going to negotiate, because she's passionate and she's gonna run after it and put some meat on them bones. So Rushane, I want to now turn to you as someone who is an attorney at law. As he's mentioned before, his company is Cunningham Law Caribbean. And we really want to know from you, what does it even mean to ratify this agreement? What is the process?
Hi, so I've really enjoyed the discussion so far. Ratification, and I think it's going to get a bit more hairy now as we touch on the legal side. And then I can understand though Elisha would have had this tumultuous experience with trying to get information. So in terms of ratification, how we operate as a Commonwealth territory is we have international law, which functions on a different plane altogether than our domestic laws. When a state or a country ratifies a treaty, it simply means that the head of state has given the consent on behalf of the country that the country intends or has a desire to be bound by the conventions of the treaty or the terms of the treaty, right? Usually when it comes on to multilateral treaties, there is a schedule that is generally attached at the end of the treaty that shows all the signatories and the states who have ratified the treaty. And the formal step usually involves the head of state signing off on an instrument of ratification and then submitting that instrument to the international organization that is in charge of promulgating the treaty. So that is it on the ratification. I suppose the next question you'll have then, Arika, is how does that really affect us? And the unfortunate truth is, even after ratifying a treaty—
Oh, there you are.
I'm back. Can you see me? Can you hear me? Great. What was the last thing you heard?
Promulgation.
So I'll pick up from there. So promulgation, what I was saying on that is, once the head of state signs off on the instrument of ratification, it is then submitted to the international organization that promulgates the treaty, right? I think the consequential question that is going to follow now is, how does ratification really affect me as part of the citizenry of the country? The truth is, there's no direct effect on us as the citizens and residents. And the reason for this is because there are two concepts in international law. One is called a monist doctrine, and the other one is called a dualist doctrine. And what this simply means is there are some jurisdictions that are what we call civil law jurisdictions. For example, the Dutch-speaking Caribbean, the French-speaking Caribbean, these territories have a legal system that relies on civil codes. And the tradition of these legal systems mean that when these states sign on to a treaty and ratify the treaty takes automatic effect in their legal system. For us who are in the English-speaking Caribbean, it is not the same for us. We operate under a dualist doctrine, and the dualist doctrine comes from English common law and how it is that the UK would have set up their own government and those who still form part of the Commonwealth of nations. Now, what it means as a dualist country is the head of state can ratify a treaty. The country can sign on to a treaty, and we have done that many times over. We have lost count of the number of treaties we have signed on to and ratified. But unless the parliament then takes an additional step to pass specific legislation to give effect to the international treaty, the ratification really not going to be affecting us. And that is perhaps a sad truth of how international law works for us in the Commonwealth.
So how do you think with, okay, yes, so Ruth would have mentioned and that some of the components or the pillars of the Escazú Agreement are presently within the Environmental Protection and Management Act of 2019. And I'm assuming that obviously the government knows that it exists in one space. So ratifying the Escazú Agreement, what does that mean for how it should treat with the EPMA?
So the first thing is that the Escazú Agreement, what it has done in effect is to consolidate all these different laws and regulations and empowerments and rights and put that into a single document that is now being described as the Escazú Agreement. It doesn't mean that there aren't elements of the agreement already existing in local laws, even in all the country, the jurisdictions who have signed on to the agreement, but the effect is to consolidate those rights. Now, if we are supposed to break down the three pillars of the Escazú Agreement, so the first one being access to information. In Antigua, we have the Freedom of Information Act.
Yes.
And the Freedom of Information Act does exactly what the objective is in the Escazú, to grant access to information being held by public authorities. And so, notwithstanding the struggle that Elisha experienced in preparing the documentary, the legislation for that would have already been in place for a request to be made from the public authorities. Now, the Freedom to Information Act goes a step further, and it gives provisions for the establishment of an information commissioner. Now, the unfortunate truth with a lot of our legislation is that we pass these legislations, we have framework in place for an oversight body or a regulatory body, and the regulatory body or committee is never actually formed. Yeah. And so you still have that challenge of, so what do I do? Because you are giving me an option on one hand, but you're not implementing it on the other hand. So I'm still stuck. Right now, I don't know for sure. I've not been able to confirm if the Information Commissioner under the Freedom to Information Act has since been appointed since the passage of the Act. And I believe that was from 2004. I am not certain of that. But the Freedom to Information Act would have given you access to public information. In some other jurisdictions, they call it Access to Information Act. So that already exists in local laws. The other pillar of the Escazú Agreement, which is the participation of citizens in the decision-making process, to the best of my knowledge, there is no existing legislation that gives that kind of right or empowerment in any sort of decision-making process. What generally obtains, and I think it is more based on custom than law, is that when Parliament is going through the process of preparing any piece of legislation, there is usually a consultation period where affected stakeholders are consulted and asked to weigh in on the effect, on the provisions, on amendments to any draft proposal of a legislation. And again, that is, to the best of my knowledge, usually just based on a matter of custom. But there is no specific legislation that says it must be done. And in fact, you have legislation that is passed without this consultative process, especially when parliaments are trying to rush legislation. And so the Escazú Agreement in that effect really does now present a very novel right that is being given now to citizens to participate in environmental making decisions. The third pillar of the agreement, which is the access to justice. And the access to justice pillar, based on my understanding, is really protection against victimization of defenders, environmental defenders. There is also, to the best of my knowledge, no existing legislation that is able to cover that sort of right. And so the question then also becomes, the Escazú Agreement has now consolidated all these things and put them together. So yes, Environmental Protection and Management Act may have elements of the Escazú Agreement, but there is, for the two second and third pillars, no existing legislation that really gives that kind of right and protection. And so what it means is we will need some form of constitutional reform to give effect to those last two pillars. And the reason I say this is because the whole purpose of the Escazú Agreement is to treat with these pillars as human rights, environmental human rights. And you know, over the last perhaps 10 or 15 years, this side of the world, and certainly within the Caribbean, we have become more inclined with these discussions on human rights and the promulgation of rights and what these freedoms actually mean, and the vast expanse of these freedoms and what should be added as additional freedoms. In fact, even with this COVID pandemic, people have been joking that the right to internet access should become a fundamental human right. And I can't tend to disagree with that, right? But in terms of human rights though, human rights are only going to be enforceable in a country and in countries that are part of the Commonwealth Caribbean if it is a part of the Constitution. And so currently in Antigua's Constitution, in Chapter 2, which deals with fundamental rights and freedoms, there is no existing right which deals with the environment. I can give an example though of constitutional reform in Jamaica. In Jamaica, back in 2011, there was an amendment to their Chapter 3 of the Constitution, which deals with fundamental rights and freedoms. And what they did in Jamaica is they inserted a right specifically to deal with protecting the environment and protecting rights that are associated with the environment. And generally, one of the rule of thumbs to know in dealing with constitutional law is that constitutions are treated as very broad. So in interpreting a provision in a constitution, it's going to be given a very broad scope of meaning and interpretation. So the very fact of including an environmental protection provision could mean many things in terms of furthering the advocacy and the rights and the access to justice that environmental defenders need.
Okay. That's a lot to think about. And I want to say thank you to one of the persons on social media who just informed me that Minister Nicholas is the Information Commissioner.
Wonderful.
Yeah, so that's been done. I know that in Antigua, I think very recently, there was some discussion about constitutional reform. So if that does happen in general, then perhaps because of the Escazú Agreement and hopefully also because of a push from us as Antiguans and Barbudans, we will see that environmental rights are listed as fundamental rights. And then that would then give the Escazú Agreement the potential for teeth within maybe an amendment of the Environmental and Protection and Management Act, or in some other form, so that at least we are very certain that we will not just have that access to participation, which is kind of, well, it is, I think, to some extent covered under the Physical Planning Act, but I think for us, it's more than just having the ability to comment on a development or a comment on a piece of legislation, but really being a part of being within that feedback loop. So, you're able to come and say, okay, these are the concerns. You're seeing the developer make those changes to his plans, his or her plans, and then being able to kind of be a part and get to a point of compromise. I think that's what I understand to be the heart of the Escazú agreement, that ability for you to really see compromise when it relates to potential changes within our natural environment. So we have heard from all of our panelists, and what I'm going to suggest, I know that I do have a few questions for them, but if there are questions from our participants who are on Zoom or you're on Facebook, please put your comments in the chat, which is on Zoom. It's right in the middle bottom of your screen. Put it in the chat and we will respond to them as much as possible. We have people who are on Twitter, on our Facebook page, as well as on Zoom. So they're all monitoring and ready and willing to hear your questions. In the meantime, for any of our panelists, what do you think are some of the barriers to speaking up about environmental issues in Antigua and Barbuda? And do you believe that once we have gone through that process of really ratifying and seeing it implemented, do you think that the Escazú Agreement can change or improve the perceptions that are relevant to really being able to speaking up about environmental issues in Antigua and Barbuda?
I guess I'll take that. Well, based on the documentary that I did, in my opinion, a lack of information and a lack of understanding of the environmental issues or how environmental issues affect any one person would have to be the number one problem. Mm-hmm. Secondly, politics. Antigua, like many other countries in the Caribbean, is born out of politics. It's either you're red, you're blue, you're orange, you're yellow. And sometimes it doesn't even matter whether the facts are put in front of you. You will agree in front of me, but then in public, you would say something different. And that doesn't help the cause, because simply encouraging somebody else to stay with the status quo, stick with the status quo. So for me, it would have to be lack of knowledge and really just the political environment here. In terms of how the Escazú Agreement would assist, to be honest, I think it would assist those people like myself who do the documentary To Speak Out, yourself, Rushane, and Ruth as well. But for the layman man, if they're not able to get over that hurdle that is politics and sorry for my term, but I'd have to use it, ignorance of the issue, then I don't think it would do them much justice. So it is incumbent on every single one of us to firstly educate people, try to break it down so that they can understand how these issues will affect them, and if not them, their grandchildren or their great-grandchildren, the people who come after them. And then we need to step a bit away from politicizing everything and get our facts, get our information so that we can make an informed decision.
Yeah, agreed. So are there any other responses? If not, I do have a question. Oh, Ruth, go ahead.
I think because our health is linked with the environment, I think people are waking up. Like the last little tropical storm. Look at the amount of devastation it caused. And that's just a tropical storm. And I think because of our size and our location as a small, vulnerable country, people gonna have to understand we can't wait. We have to ensure that our natural protections are maintained and strengthened.
Mhm.
There's a company in Jamaica, Smith Warner. They are doing an online course. And I never knew Antigua, because of its location, was the #1 for climate risk and exposure. I never knew that. I knew we are impacted, but when they said Antigua is #1 of 20 countries globally, and you know that, it means that we have to have our house in order. We cannot be tearing down, clearing our lands, cutting our mangroves, shelling
Dredging up our seagrass beds and coastal reefs.
I think if people understand that, they'll do something. The very survival is at stake.
Yeah.
The very survival. And we have to be proactive. We have to have preventative measures in place. And we have to learn from our bad mistakes. The mistakes we made already, we cannot continue to make them. So economics, social, and environmental, they have to come together. They have to be aligned. It's not economics, because we can get the economics and get washed away. So people have to start understanding exactly what's happening in our small island with these natural protective systems. I think the older people knew and they valued them, but the current generation, maybe that local knowledge has not been sufficiently passed on to the current generation, and we are having these issues, but we have to deal with them.
Yeah, I don't always agree with the older generation knowing, because I believe it's the older generation that allowed Jolly Beach to happen. So I think it's what has been the situation, which is what you touched on, is that there is that disconnect between environment and the social issues. And so because economic. So because you're so concerned about the economy and the need to make sure to feed people, and I agree with the need to feed people, I agree with the need to give people work, but we also have to make sure that you give them work and you're not giving them the work so that they can pay for the re-engineering of your natural systems to fix back what they had for free. Anyway, so there's a question from our Facebook chat, and I think this one is probably for Rashane. The person says, until our laws are amended to allow us to enforce the agreement, what protection do environmental defenders currently have in their in the implementation or in their discussion of environmental issues?
That's a very pointed question, because, and the answer might be a very unfortunate one. Unless and until there is this kind of constitutional reform to give effect to the Escazú Agreement, there is no express protection for environmental defenders. I think it's, apart from the Access to Information Act, or the which we have already discussed, the second and third pillars of the agreement, there is really no express protection. And I think it's going to come down to a matter of trying to use existing laws, and even that is going to be difficult, because when you look at the existing freedoms on discrimination, they're very specific, and they don't necessarily extend or lend themselves, notwithstanding the very broad interpretation given to these things, to specifically protect environmental defenders. Yeah. And I think it's such a difficult thing. So let me use a scenario. So if it is that an environmental defender feels like he or she is being victimized, for example, an application is made for assistance with acquiring housing, and you believe that your application was specifically denied or turned down because you are this environmental activist. Now, the only recourse that may be available to you under the law is to go by way of judicial review. And even if you go by way of judicial review, there's still no guarantee that you will succeed, because judicial review means that you are asking the court to review the decision of this public authority in denying you a grant on the application, because you're saying that the decision was irrational or it was based on bias. But then you also are required to prove those things.
Yes.
And then being able to prove that may also be a challenge, right? So the beautiful thing about the Escazú agreement is that it would have given you this express protection so that you wouldn't have to try all sorts of gymnastics in the law to try and find protection. And so without that, we're still left with just doing the gymnastics. And oftentimes we might not be able to succeed on that.
Mm. Okay, so there are 3 questions in the chat presently. The first question is, what does the enforcement structure for the rights prescribed in the Escazú agreement look like?
Okay, if I can answer that. There is a compliance committee. That's part of the plan. Remember, the agreement has just come into force, so the first COP has not even been held. But for the agenda, for the December 9th, official 9th and 10 meetings, they're going to look at rules of procedure, subsidiary bodies, the compliance mechanism, and the funding for this agreement. So I wanted to add, the environmental defenders are not opposing for the sake of opposing. They're giving us knowledge that it seems the current government or the organization doesn't have. If I'm telling you this is a wetlands, why would instead, when I tell you it's a wetlands, you have your plans, you have to show a mitigation effort. So basically what the environmental defenders are doing, they're trying to give us information, and they're trying to keep, especially in Latin America, to keep maybe the lands on the forest, or maybe the mining is causing problems. But we need to see the knowledge as beneficial in our development, especially for what's happening in Antigua. The knowledge is to help us to see that some risk exists in this project. And if we can accept that and build it into the project, I think that's something good. Yes. I don't see why we should have conflicts.
Yes.
And work together, because if you don't put the mitigation efforts into place, the project is gonna fall by the way at some point. That's what happened at Jolly Harbor. You put things in a wetland, our whole community suffers. You can't fix that. And I think if we follow this approach of the local knowledge, we would get resources, because we can say, this is the information from the local knowledge holders. This is important, the culture of the area, the history. Maybe there was some kind of important site. But then, so what I'm trying to say, you can get multiple benefits by using the local knowledge of the people, instead of saying, you're not educated, I don't have no degree. It don't have to lead to a conflict situation. It can be, an embracing situation where the whole country benefits.
Agreed. So there's another question. How can the agreement be used to clean up the EIA, or environmental impact assessment process, and get meaningful input and participation of stakeholders in setting the terms of reference and having their views heard and acted upon? So just as I guess a point of reference for some persons who may not know, there's already a process for determining whether a development happens, which is through the environmental impact assessment process. The terms of references for that are so like what a developer has to kind of look at and mitigate to kind of make sure that it doesn't cause a lot of harm is determined by the Department of Environment. So I think what this participant is asking is how does the Escazú agreement help us to be a part of that process where we can say, okay, well, yes, Department of Environment, I know these are the 5 things that you think the developer needs to look at, but as a community, as the persons who are going to be affected, these are an additional 6.
If I can add to that, Erica, if you go through a lot of the projects that are submitted, they have to meet these strict guidelines for local knowledge, participation, and we put them in the project. We write them in. But then when the project is funded, these things don't happen.
Yes, but that's a bit different, Ruth. If I'm building a hotel, or I'm, that there's no requirement for me to involve local people. So I think it's more about probably asking more about how can we request more for our voices to be included in the terms of reference. Because, like, for instance, I do know that right now there's a environmental impact assessment that's out for consideration for public comment in Barbuda. And, so people can comment on it, yes. But I think what people are saying is we want to be a part of even before you get to that point. How do we deal with it before you get there? How do we ensure that our voices are heard, and is when we do that level of, I guess, constitutional reform, or even when we're looking at the regulations, Rashane, for under the Environmental Protection and Management Act, can those things be written in that you are maybe making an amendment to the act to say, well, when you're developing the terms of reference, you must consult with all persons concerned? Is that something that could be done?
It is possible to write into ordinary legislation a mandatory step that must be taken before any final decision or action can be taken in respect of some project or transaction. And I'm going to call it a difficulty. The reason I'm calling it a difficulty is because the objective of the Escazú agreement and the 2nd and 3rd pillars of the agreement is to establish environmental human rights. And you can only establish human rights through constitutional reform. And so having a provision in ordinary legislation which says a step must be done will be mandatory, yes. And if there is a breach of that step, you may be able to again file for judicial review. And judicial review is the primary method that is used in challenging public or administrative decisions or omissions. But the truth is, having it in ordinary legislation still does not give the same amount of weight and protection as it would have under the Constitution. And the reason for this is because based on our legal system, and when you look at the Constitution itself, there's an express clause in the Constitution which says, this Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And any law that is in contravention of the Constitution shall be void to that extent, right? And that was just a paraphrase, and that is how it is generally worded in all the Commonwealth Caribbean constitutions. But what it means is the Constitution is supreme. And so every other law must bow and be subject to the Constitution. And so putting a mandatory step in an ordinary law still does not raise it to the level that it was intended to receive under the Escazú Agreement, unless
then they can be overrides.
Precisely.
Okay, I think that that actually hits to the heart of the matter, because I'm seeing in the comments that, PLH and YIDA did not have any strict requirements. We're seeing that, even when the EIA process is involved, there are steps that can be skipped. and it's because our environmental rights are not constitutional rights. So what I'm gathering from this evening's conversation, and unfortunately we are at the end of said conversation, is that we really have to be looking very strongly at constitutional reform and pushing for our environmental rights and our right to justice as an environmental defender, our rights to access to information, all of that within the Constitution, so that the Escazú Agreement is not just another thing that we have signed. It is not just another paper, another thing that we can hold up and say, oh, but you signed this, but rather that it really has teeth and it really makes a difference for the people who do defend the environment on a daily basis. So I do want to say thank you to our panelists this evening. Thank you so much for participating. I thank people who are on Zoom, the persons who joined in the conversation on Facebook as well. Thank you so much for being here. We really do appreciate that you came out to be with us tonight. We really do hope to have conversations and continue to have conversations like this, because I think it really shines a light on how we need to really think about our work moving forward, not just as the Environmental Awareness Group, but us as Antiguans and Barbudans. So if you do have suggestions for things that you would like for us to discuss moving forward, please send them to us. We will work it into our work plan. Don't worry about how we'll figure it out. We'll figure it out. Send it to us. Send it to us by email at eagantigua@gmail.com. You can give us a call at 462-6236, or send us a direct message on Instagram, on Facebook, and on Twitter at EAGAntigua. And also, I would like to remind you that you can also become a member of the Environmental Awareness Group. Being a member of a group like ours really helps all of us, because then it means that when we go to our, when we speak up, then we're not just speaking for our staff, but we're speaking for a range of people who are a part of the discussion. So join the Environmental Awareness Group so that your voice can also be heard and counted. And if you don't want to join, you can always donate, or you can do both. That's also great. So those links are available in the chat. So join, you can also donate. Again, I want to say just a really huge thank you to our panelists this evening. Thank you to Ruth, who continues to be at the forefront of environmental discussion, and especially having those conversations with our community groups. Thank you to Elisha. I admire your courage in your investigative report. It was quite honestly fantastic. And I'm really hoping that we see people asking those questions that help us to really get to a point where we can have further conversation, and not just conversation, but change. And thank you, Rashane, for being a part this evening. I know that this is kind of left field from what you normally do in terms of work, but I think you really opened our eyes to where we need to go moving forward. And I really do appreciate that. So thank you everyone who has been a part of this discussion. We look forward to having more of these in the future. And I am Arika Hill from the EAG. Good night.